Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in for the latest Engerati webinar. I'm Dan Loosemore, the Managing Director here at Engerati. I'll be chairing this afternoon's webinar with our partner Copperleaf, looking at the growing challenge in the age of digitalisation of investment planning in an age nowadays of technology becoming ubiquitous faster than at any time previously. Before introducing the themes and contributors in more detail, we have just a couple of housekeeping items to run through. Of course, the webinar will, as ever, be available on demand on engerati.com, so please do share with colleagues and industry professionals who you feel would also benefit from today's key learnings. As always, we like Engerati webinars to be as interactive as possible. If you have any questions for our presenters this afternoon, please do submit them as we go along, and I promise to tackle as many of them as possible within the allotted hour this afternoon. As listeners will recognise, with technology deployments vying for prioritisation alongside aging legacy systems that need ongoing maintenance, choosing what projects to execute when, and addressing ROI on this capital spend is a growing challenge. Many utilities are still not necessarily developing roadmaps that fully align with operational priorities, and this usually results in higher costs and stretched budgets. It's a familiar scenario. As we'll hear this afternoon, solutions are beginning to emerge to address this challenge, minimising risk and investing in the areas that will have the highest value through closer enterprise portfolio management and PPM. To share more with us this afternoon on some of these solutions, we're joined by Stefan Sandecki, the Managing Director in Europe for Copperleaf. Stefan has worked with Engerati for many years now, and at Copperleaf works with partners directly as well as those with asset-intensive organisations to solve some of those investment planning challenges. His background is in business analytics and consulting, and he is an active member of the Institute of Asset Management. Stefan's also joined this afternoon by Nat Williams, who's the Managing Director of Smart Grid Services at Accenture. Nat leads Accenture's work with energy distribution companies in the UK and Ireland, having begun his career on Transco on the National Grid graduate scheme. He later moved into consulting with Accenture in 2006 and combines deep business knowledge with delivery expertise to help clients shape and deliver major business transformation programs. Asset management has always been an important focus for Nat, and he's seen firsthand how it's moved from a relatively new or undeveloped business area to one that's become fundamental to business success, specifically in the utility space that we're obviously focusing in on this afternoon. He is particularly passionate about the use of new technologies to help push utilities on to the next performance frontier, which is going to be a key focus for this webinar this afternoon. Nat, Stefan, great to have you joining us again this afternoon, and I'll kick across to yourself, Stefan, if I can, first of all, to start the presentation this afternoon. Thank you both.
So, hi guys, it's Nat Williams here. Thank you for the introduction. As we commence, I realise perhaps I should introduce Accenture as well. Many of you will be familiar with us. For those of you that aren't, we specialise in providing services from strategy through consulting, digital technology implementation and operational support. We do that with an emphasis on utilities, one of our largest industry groups, and there are over 15,000 of us in the utilities area. Today we're going to be talking about digital asset management, passion of mine, but also a specific offering area for Accenture where we bring together all of those services to help clients look from investment strategy, planning, right the way through use of technology, tools, new ways of working, to eventually deliver increased return on invested capital and look at optimization of outputs delivered for the end consumer. So delighted to share our perspective today, and thank you for having us. Thanks, Nat, and good afternoon, everyone. Stefan Sandecki here. I'm responsible for Copperleaf's operations in Europe. I've been focused on supporting clients improve their investment decision-making for many years, both as a management consultant and now with Copperleaf. Experience in gas, water, electrical, T&D, and in rail. For those of you not familiar with Optimise, we're a Canadian software company based in Vancouver. We have over 150 employees globally with regional teams focused on North America, managing critical infrastructure, our vision is to empower businesses like yours to make the highest value investment decisions. Over 30 global thought leaders have adopted our software solution C55 and our approach for asset investment planning and management. So, as we look at the agenda, we'll start off, and I'll give a view on some of the trends we're seeing and the conversations we're having most with our utilities clients, and really why we're seeing increased focus on the area of project portfolio management. Stefan and I will then sort of tag team as we take you through what we see as 5 keys to success and offer our perspectives there. We'll then round out with some thoughts on when we see people typically deploying these new capabilities and a view on how people tend to get started. And then obviously we'll close out with your questions and answers after that. So to move into a perspective on our industry, it's funny, at the weekend I met some old college friends of mine who when I entered utilities 20 years ago, were sort of teasing me about the boring industry I entered, and I'm sure many of you will have the same sort of conversation, but the truth of the matter is that utilities has never been more exciting. In the same conversation with the same people, we were talking about the electric vehicle that one of them had bought and the solar panels that their parents had deployed on their house. So energy is really front page news, and it's in all of our conversations. What does that mean for us in the utilities industry? Well, it is exciting. We do get to have better conversations with our friends, and that's nice. But it is becoming fundamentally that bit more difficult to operate. We're seeing an industry where, if you look at EV take-up going from 2 million in 2016 to over 530 million cars worldwide in 2040, combined with something like storage going from 3 gigawatts to 930 gigawatts in the same period, you've got a very complex landscape you need to manage. At the same time, if we consider our businesses, we've got assets that are aging, and frankly, a workforce which matches. And we'll talk about workforces retiring in the next 5 to 10 years being up to 30 or 40% of the workforce. So that presents challenges. And equally, we're looking at regulators who are pushing utilities really hard. I think if I reflect on my market in the UK, we've had Ofgem recently announced that in the next price control review, they're looking to reduce UK total expenditure by over £5 billion. And they'll do that whilst placing strong constraints on asset health and the delivered outputs to consumers. So it's complex. We're being asked as an industry to do more with less money and a smaller skilled workforce perhaps. And it's really going to matter how well we make the decisions about how we spend our money. The average utility will have over £100 million relying on the quality of decision making in investment spend. And those decisions are now going to need to take into account many more factors, variables, constraints, and outputs. So it's getting more difficult, but we need to improve. So what's holding us back? I like this survey. It really zooms in on the barriers to improving investment decision making. So my favorite piece is that only 5% of utility executives are happy with their investment decision making capability. So that sets a tone. And if we look at the challenges that many are facing, then clearly budgets are a factor, and that echoes what I was saying before. But also, I think, recognizing the cultural barriers and perhaps the silos. Anytime money's involved, clearly internal politics also get involved. And if we're looking at making the very best decisions we really need to have a way of cutting through that and getting a very clear view of the business case and return on investment and taking an enterprise view of that as we compare one option to another. So project portfolio management, to me, is the key capability in enabling that. We need to have really strong capabilities. And I've seen a big shift. I think we've seen an evolution in the capability of managing projects and portfolios of projects from an operational sense to being one of much more strategic and decision-making focus. And it's an area where, particularly as the price controls are getting stronger, we're really seeing executive focus in that area. So if I was to sort of introduce TPM as a concept, I like looking at the Gartner framing of this, and it does show that evolution that I was talking about. And that's good news, because the tool set we need to make those excellent decisions is evolving with us. So you can see here a build-up in the pyramid from an initial wave of project collaboration tools that we'll all remember about sharing information, and now we would use things like SharePoint and content management, etc., to help us execute the projects better. We then move up through the traditional work management tools, where you're looking at the enterprise asset management suites, managing work, portfolios of projects, etc. And then, I guess, up until a few years ago, the maturity capped out at projects and portfolio management. And you're talking about the main traditional vendors there. And what we've seen most recently is that final piece of the pyramid, and it's what I call dynamic portfolio level tool. And it's focusing in on factors like investment planning and budgeting, looking at the strategy and how that translates into the investment portfolio, looking across an enterprise level view of portfolios. So breaking down those silos that we were talking about before and enabling a complete view of the spend. And then making those decisions much better. So a dynamic view of modeling the risk, the outputs, the spend, etc., that we're going to develop. And then finally, considering the fact that we live in a constrained world. And so for me, that's the framework for project and portfolio management we'll talk through, and we'll be focusing in on that top piece of the pyramid today. So I'll now hand over to Stefan to talk through the first few of our keys to success.
Great, thanks, Matt. So we're going to talk today about what we see as the 5 keys to success for asset-intensive organizations. And I stress that we're focused on the specific needs and requirements of asset-intensive organizations. And what I mean by that is we're not going to focus on lots of the core project and portfolio management capabilities that you will need as part of your process. So things like having a consistent process, having a repository for your candidate projects. We're really going to focus in on the specific requirements and capabilities that you need for making optimal investment decisions across your asset investment portfolios. So if you're looking at transforming your PPM processes, you want to make sure that the processes you're looking to put in place can get you to the efficient frontier, and more on that later. So the first of these keys to success that I'm going to talk about is around developing a value framework. So when talking about a value framework, it's important to define what we mean by value. Value can mean different things to different people, as this cartoon shows. If we're wanting to embed a consistent process for project evaluation, we need a common definition across the organization. Some of you will be familiar with the ISO 55000 standard for asset management. So ISO 55000 says that assets exist to provide value to the organization and its stakeholders. That value can be tangible or intangible, can be financial or non-financial, but essentially be determined by the organizations themselves and your stakeholders in accordance with your organizational objectives. Also recommends the establishment of decision-making processes that reflect stakeholder need and define that value. And so that's very much where this value framework comes in. At Copperleaf, we work with clients to develop your value frameworks. And this means defining the appropriate value measures So there's a line of sight or alignment between individual investment decisions you're making and corporate strategy. The first point I wanted to make is we're wanting to support a process that considers the entire investment portfolio. The chart here shows a sample portfolio where the size of the area of each box represent the investment spend, the euros or the pounds or the dollars within each of these sub-portfolios. A value framework must support decisions across all of these portfolios. For example, an organisation may have an accepted methodology for assessing asset-based risk, but how does that relate to the other portfolios, and how can they make choices between them? And this really boils down to really the challenge of assessing a vast array of diverse projects. And people often think the challenge is like comparing apples with oranges and even giraffes. For example, you could have a project to replace an aging transformer that will generate value to you because of some asset risk that you're mitigating. You may have a smart grid initiative, so support for some distributed energy resources that may mitigate a capacity risk, and at the same time bring some environmental benefits and even public perception benefits to your organisation. Or you may be looking at an IT project that would mitigate some cybersecurity risk or improve workforce productivity. And there's not going to be a single set of measures that is applicable to all of these projects, but what you need is a set of measures within your framework that provides coverage across all of your strategic objectives of your organisation. This next slide here just gives an example of a value framework that we developed with a European distribution utility. And you see how it splits into getting alignment with their five strategic objectives, and underneath each one of those with a series of value measures. Beneath each of the measures is a series of models that helps the organisation quantify the impacts a value can have on these, a project can have on these measures. And then what you're wanting to do is, across your portfolio, is to start assessing projects against these measures. And you may have a first project in this example that is bringing some increased revenue. It's making some improvements on the reliability factor, and has an investment cost as well. And that gives a certain net present value to the organisation. Whereas a second and a third project may impact different measures. But what you're wanting to do is to assess these projects on a common scale so that you can compare these projects across your organisation.
Yeah, and second, I think that it really helps with the cost-benefit analysis. It's an area that here in the UK I've seen a lot more emphasis on. I think in the previous price control we had to submit a sample of cost-benefit analysis, and I think it's an area we'll see more emphasis on. I know colleagues of mine in America, they've been having to present a clear cost-benefit analysis on every area or every intervention. And I think that's a trend we'll probably see certainly here in the UK. And I guess here, for simplicity, you've articulated particular projects and how you compare projects, but also we're also thinking about how we consider multiple alternatives, like you say, build, no build solutions, or do nothing. And so I think the help a value framework can do in coming up with that common cost-benefit analysis effort will be excellent.
So we've talked a little bit around developing a value framework, and the next step up on our ladder here is really around modelling asset life cycles and understanding how time plays a huge impact into these investment decisions. So let's go back to basics for a minute and consider asset risk. Typically the product of a probability of failure and a consequence. We prefer to have monetized consequences so that the risk can be measured in euros or pounds or dollars or whatever. We typically see that baseline risks increase over time, as we see with the red line here on this chart, and this is because assets degrade, and so their probability of failure increases. We can consider interventions in these assets, whether replacement or refurbishment activity, that mitigates some of this risk. And so that's what this green line here is doing. The outcome risk or the residual risk is what is left following the intervention, following the investment. In this instance, the risk is reduced in 2024 before steadily climbing again as the refurbished or the replaced asset itself begins to age. And so when we talk about the value of carrying out this investment, it's essentially the gap between the red and the green line, as you see in the blue chart at the bottom. And what we want to do is then pull that back to a net present value, so you can understand the value of carrying out that investment at a particular point in time. And just to give you an example here from a gas distribution client, this risk chart is looking at a low pressure gas main. In particular, there's a risk model behind this quantification that's concerned with the material of the pipe. In this case, it's asbestos cement, the particular diameter. This is a tier 1 for less than 8 inches. And this chart shows one component of that monetized risk, namely the carbon risk related to this asset. And so in this case, there's a model that calculates that quantity of carbon, risk. A fracture or failure of this asset leads to a loss of gas. That loss of gas has a carbon equivalent value, and then you can put a monetized value on that. And so this is what organizations are doing across their networks, across their different assets.
And I think, Stefan, that's certainly one of the things we're seeing about moving to a common methodology. So in the UK, we've got this concept of monetized risk across the board, and it's not just the direct and operational impacts of asset failure. It's all these other factors that we then need to consider.
And the next point is, well, after considering the risks across your assets, is suddenly understanding that the value you get from carrying out an investment, a refurbishment or replacement, actually depends on the timing of that investment. And given that risks typically increase as the asset ages, you see a change in that value. So as we described before, the grey area here is the value you can get from carrying out this investment. But if you change the intervention date, you'll be getting a different amount of value.
And I think this is a really good example of the difference between the sort of third level and the fourth level in that Gartner pyramid, about a dynamic portfolio view, because clearly the impact of deferring by a year can be profoundly different. You might have an asset that's way more likely to fail, or one that could well manage that extra year. So I think it's certainly the difference between those traditional solutions and the new dynamic ones.
And to explore that point further, considering the cost of deferral when you're looking at multiple projects, or if you're looking at different alternatives in a single project, the chart here shows the value of an investment based on the project start date. You consider the blue line here on this chart. It's a high value investment. It's also an urgent investment in the sense that if we were to defer it, we would lose value very quickly, as we don't get value if we carry out this project in later years. The curve of the black investment suggests actually you don't want to intervene immediately. The asset has still got some useful life, and actually the optimal time to invest is around 2019. And the brown curve at the top, it's the highest value investment, but actually it's not that urgent for you within your portfolio. You can happily defer that investment and know you're not losing that much value. And so this is an example with just 3 sample projects, and as I'm sure you appreciate, organisations like yourselves will be looking at hundreds or thousands of projects and trying to work out which are the best projects to select, but also when to carry out those investments. The final point here, we have been talking about a single intervention. Just worth mentioning that sophisticated utilities are considering multiple interventions and kind of complex repeats across the asset life cycles. So instead of making an isolated investment decisions, organisations wanting to understand the full life cycle costs, both the cost and the value, so understanding how that changes over time.
I think this is a really important one. More and more of my clients are looking beyond the next price control, and they're getting longer and longer investment plans. And so I think, you don't need to start off doing this, but the ability to look out beyond your immediate horizon and look not just at that first intervention but beyond, I think is really important as we start thinking about broader planning and investment management. So as we go into the next piece, which is really looking at constraints and ensuring that we factor those in to a deliverable plan, I'm reminded of my days in asset management where we would come up with the best possible plan in theory and then go into some challenging discussions with our operational counterparts. And I think what we're saying here is actually being well aware of those constraints up front and making sure that a plan, a collective plan, is deliverable is one of the hardest pieces and one of the greatest keys to success. I think that the constraints now are beyond simple budgetary constraints. Talked a little earlier about aging assets and aging workforces. A project where we worked together with Copperleaf, with an electricity transmission company, was really primarily driven by a constraint in workforce capacity in the upcoming period. So the challenge was, how do we really optimize what we're going to do with that workforce in the coming years? How do we make sure that we're getting them to do exactly the right work? Similarly, in Europe, one of my clients is really focusing on reducing planned outages and making sure that they're not just looking within year at bundling, they're looking across year, and they're managing that as a constraint because of the impacts on, yes, the network, but also customers, etc. And there are many other constraints that we're seeing now. So whether it is financial, safety, risk, etc., the key is to consider that up front and make sure that you iterate your plan in cognizance of that, and that you come up with a deliverable plan. Certainly a phrase that I'm hearing more and more is about the desire for plan stability. And I think you drive plan stability through considering those constraints, project dependencies, etc., appropriately up front. You can minimize that churn later. If we move into just a simple illustration of this, and we'll look across 3 constraints. We've got effectively project management and design resource constraints, and we've got a cost constraint here. And this is a sort of pre-optimization view of what the portfolio might look like. And we then start to apply some real-world constraints. For example, budget, normally the first constraint to apply. And we start to apply that. We then layer in design engineering, where we might have a maximum across each individual year of 500 hours. Similarly, specialist project management resource. We might have a minimum and a maximum. So we've got resources that we need to ensure are productive, as well as making sure we don't exceed capacity. And we take those and we apply a level of optimization and smoothing, you can see here a view of the optimization of those constraints and the impact of that. And this really is a gross simplification, actually, if we think about a world where we've got millions of combinations. And that really takes us into the next keys to success, which is to look beyond the constraints and even beyond prioritization into optimization. And so if I reflect back on when I started, we did the cost-benefit analysis, we lined them all up, we looked at our budget, and we drew a line. We drew a cut line prioritization across the scoring, and yes, that score may have evolved, but actually that approach is no longer fit for purpose. We're now looking at a new regime where we've got to consider many more alternatives and factors, whether it's build versus no build, whether it's time-based impacts like Stefan articulated, or indeed alternative investment strategies, looking at the timing perhaps within a price control of the impact of a particular intervention or investment strategy. So what do we mean by optimization? Well, really, for me, there are three optimization strategies that we see ourselves adopting. One, and probably the traditional one, is about financial optimization. So how do I use my budget to deliver the most value without breaking the bank? So that's the simple financial optimization. The second is then about resource-based optimization. So how do I determine that optimal solution that doesn't require any more resources, or indeed less, than we have available? So looking at that resource-based optimization. And the last one, and something which I think is almost becoming the most important as I consider regulators looking at output-based regulation and service levels becoming more and more important, is to look at effectively how can I achieve the most with that least amount of money. So what is the least cost solution to deliver the service levels and outputs that I need to maintain? And that really is critical in optimizing my investment spend and making sure that I meet the objectives that I've set out. So those are three different strategies, and they're not mutually exclusive. And I think one of the recommendations we would have is to combine those and make sure you're cognizant of each in the same way you're cognizant of the constraints that led to some of those. When we talk about optimization, we also refer to the efficient frontier. And this isn't a new concept. It's something which began in academia in the 50s and really has been used in financial circles to talk about investors earning the maximum return on their investment. And so you're basically assessing the risk you're willing to take and the return that you can expect to get, or indeed the combination of investments that will lead to that. And so here, when we talk about optimization, what we're really talking about doing is combining all of the investment alternatives and looking at the makeup of those. And for example, one of these little blue folders or portfolios could well have an optimization that allows it to progress up to the efficient frontier. Frankly, if it didn't, we wouldn't be looking at it. So that's critical in ensuring we get the best return on investment across any different spectrum. And it's an area which I know, Stefan, you've been doing some research into quantifying. It's often very difficult. And when I'm speaking to clients about business cases for investment in these sorts of capabilities, it's a difficult one to pin down.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so we've actually been working with the University of Southampton. We did a research study where we were looking to quantify, well, what is the incremental benefits of optimization compared to more traditional prioritization. And so we looked at this over many portfolios, and the results of that study showed that actually optimization can achieve 7% to 20% greater portfolio value compared to more traditional cut line prioritization.
So for my clients, I guess that could easily be, 35 to 50 million pounds per annum just through that approach. It's certainly an important consideration.
And then our final key to success here is really about making sure you keep the plan up to date. Matt talked a little bit about plan stability, and the best way to ensure some of that stability is to make sure that you're turning this into a continuous process, and it's not part of an annual budget review, which you kind of start from scratch at a certain point in time every year. And the reason why that's important is because in the real world things change. So the optimal decisions you may have made at the beginning of a budget cycle might not necessarily be the best as you progress through. And that could be because of emergent work that's come into your portfolio, or a particular project may not have got the right approvals to progress through, and so it's been delayed. And so what you're wanting to do is to have a view of the plan at all points in time, and be able to make sure that you can continuously steer your investment dollars the best place possible. And so that means having the ability to re-optimize your plan and make in-flight changes. And just to give you an example here, this is an example from one of our clients in the water sector. They've really looked to embed a continuous process for investment planning and management. The first 5 steps on this cycle kind of very much line up with some of that capability Nat and I have been talking about, around defining the outcomes that they're looking to achieve through their planning process, and that's around defining that value framework, identifying risks, identifying solutions, evaluating those solutions against the framework, and then essentially optimizing that plan to come up with the best set of projects that meet their stakeholder requirements. But when you move on to the left-hand side of this diagram, you're really talking about that continuous loop with the delivery of those plans. So the projects move into execution, move into delivery, and what we recommend doing is monitoring those plans, so tracking the actuals, how much you're spending against those projects, understanding the reforecast of those projects to complete, and then reviewing your plans to make sure that at any point in time you're happy and you're making the optimal decisions. I think the final point just on here is we've talked about these 5 keys to success for asset-intensive organisations, and of course, like I mentioned before, there's a whole host of core project and portfolio management capabilities that you'll be wanting as well. A repository for your investment ideas, electronic workflows to support approval processes. Everyone always wants great reporting and visualization to really help communicate and really help the transparency of that plan.
So I guess to start to close off, how and when to get started. And when is an interesting point for me. It's not always the case. But look, for me, the business case in ramping up capability really intensifies in these sorts of scenarios. So those can be, for example, where there's a regulatory review, a new regulatory period coming up, and the need to be able to model a number of scenarios, a number of impacts, and really engage in a sort of fact-based discussion with the regulator about the impact. So the impact to the risk profile of your network based on a spend that the regulator is willing to embrace. And so I guess if we look at some of the water and gas clients that you were talking about earlier, Stefan, that's exactly the sort of point I guess they're going into, and they've now got a capability to allow them to have that dynamic discussion with the regulator. The second area is then either driven by regulatory scrutiny or indeed now increasingly shareholder expectations. We've seen an enormous appreciation in the value of utilities to investors, and with any acquisition comes expectations about the performance, financial performance that they can extract. And so when either of those, or indeed both of those combine, I think optimization comes to the fore. You know, the traditional plan is no longer going to be enough to deliver the profitability. So that's the second area. The third would then be around capacity, and I talked about the Canadian example about where their workforce was really the constraint, and they needed to make sure they got the very best value from their spend. The fourth area, and this is relatively new conversation that I'm starting to have, but it is coming up, and it's quite interesting, is that actually for a long time the people making these decisions and feeding into them, you know, were experts in their own right, and perhaps they're approaching retiring age as well. And so having this in a centralized repository in a consistent fashion is really helping manage the knowledge around the assets and helping manage that whole process. And then finally, one thing that I've seen certainly here in the UK is when you need to deliver greater transparency and tracking at asset level, frankly, around spend, outputs, and health, and indeed risk, having a cohesive process and capability that we've talked about, and a solid view that links all of the investment spend to those outputs and indeed to the assets is vital. So those are really the prompts. I guess, Stefan, would you mind talking us through how to get started?
Yes, and there's of course multiple different ways to get started around increasing capability in this area. One of the things that is central to enhanced decision making is the value framework that I talked about earlier as the first key to success. And some organisations may have a very good idea of what that value framework looks like for them, but others may want some support in trialling a value-based approach to the decision making. So one approach we've taken is to trial this approach and really to help organisations like yourselves understand the different types of decisions you can make once you've embedded this capability. So this example here, we worked with a European distribution organisation to firstly identify the different value measures that captured benefits from the projects across their portfolio. And so that was the first job. The second was around aligning those metrics to a financial scale so that we could compare different projects between these diverse value measures. And then what we did is we took a sample portfolio. In this case, it was 34 candidate projects, but what was important, it was a set of projects that were representative from across the different portfolio, so people could really understand how these capabilities could support the evaluation of different projects, which up until that point they may have considered to be so different, like the apples and oranges example that I showed before. And then once we'd assessed these projects, we were then able to showcase what the optimization could support in terms of the improved decision making. So the outcome of this engagement was the organisation could really identify how enhanced capability could help them make improved decisions, how it could enhance their processes, and ultimately feed in a little bit to the business case for making that change.
So I guess why change, and clearly there's a capability here and the business case that we're seeing is backed up on fundamentally making better spend decisions and getting more value for your investment. So eliminating, number one, moving away from the inefficient projects and programs to the efficient frontier, so removing any negative value investments, and then looking at optimization to get the most value, and looking at that across the spectrum of constraints and drivers that your strategy is setting out. You can then look to achieve more from your regulatory settlement, or indeed if you find yourself in or mid-period, enabling some greater outperformance. And then finally, an operational one really about having greater stability. And I guess we've all worked in this industry for long enough to realize that the more stable our plan, the better we can contract, the better we can execute, and the better we can deliver value out of the entire supply chain. So a number of benefits, and I guess a number of times when people change, but fundamentally about getting more from less, which is what our customers and our regulators are starting to expect from us as an industry. And with that, I think we'll hand back to Dan to field some of your questions.
Hi, Nat, Stefan, thanks ever so much for that really in-depth presentation there. We've had a lot of member questions come in asking for copies of the slides. Just to remind everyone, they'll be available to download immediately following the completion of the webinar this afternoon. We've also had an awful lot of questions come in, Nat and Stefan, so hope you're ready for 12 minutes that we have left now of Q&A. I'll pack in as many questions as I possibly can. The first ones that have come in are built largely around how you build up the quantity of data needed to make these optimized, not prioritized decisions, and what data build is necessary there. How much is needed for that system to really work? I don't know if, Stefan, you want to try and tackle that one first.
Yeah, so we often get asked a similar question to that in terms of organizations concerned they don't have enough data to support the processes that Nat and I have been describing here. But actually what I tend to say is, well, you're already carrying out this process today. You're already deciding where to invest and deciding between different candidate projects. So what we're looking to do is make improvements on that process. And so we're very confident that just by moving to a more value-based approach, you can get greater consistency on top of the processes you've already got today. And yes, over time, if you want to add in more sophisticated risk models or get better data quality in certain areas, you absolutely can, but you can add that in incrementally. I think the key thing is you can make improvements today based on the data you've already got.
Yeah, look, Stefan, it's an area that I discuss in implementation a lot with clients about, do I have the data quality, etc. And the reality is that these decisions, you effectively make the decisions anyway today based on the quality of data you have, but you're I guess, manually or guessing what the gaps might be and how they might be addressed. And what we're talking about here is just applying a different discipline across that. And actually we end up finding that after you start implementing those sorts of processes and using it, that it helps you identify areas where you most want to repair the data and indeed suggest areas you can. So I think data is a key enabler, but not a barrier.
Yeah, and we've had some additional questions here. One of them asking how you can turn non-financial measures into financial ones. So, for example, the stakeholder engagement, levels of customer service, the environmental impact. And I think the answer here is there's different approaches you can take. different levels of sophistication, again, depending on what data you've got, the maturity of your organizations. So some clients of ours will use a risk matrix type approach. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, having a risk matrix with different levels of consequence for a minor or major or catastrophic impact, and just aligning definitions for, say, environmental consequences to a risk matrix, and aligning your environmental impacts with maybe your reputational impacts, and aligning that to a financial metric as well. And so a risk matrix approach is one way to go about it. Other organizations will develop more sophisticated models. So the example I showed earlier around monetizing the cost of carbon. Again, that's focus on one of those environmental areas. So there's different ways to do that. We as Copperleaf, we've actually got a lot of experience building these value frameworks with our clients. And while sometimes these models themselves are not rocket science, but what we can bring is confidence that these models can be used successfully as part of a decision-making process. And so that value framework library we've got can help accelerate the development of the value framework.
Thanks, Stefan. I think that links quite nicely onto another question around how to use those value frameworks and plug these various models into it. We mentioned some of the challenges there in terms of turning non-financial requirements into that matrix. We've had another question come in around how you keep all the individual stakeholders happy within the business with this sort of asset optimization framework. You've got sort of, for example, workforce management staff looking predominantly, obviously, in self-interest at workforce issues. Then you've got shareholders who are obviously looking more towards those immediate financial returns. You've got technology heads who are obviously looking to put a lot of new kit onto the network itself. How do you keep all those individual stakeholders happy and aligned behind the ultimate roadmap? Nat, maybe that's one for yourself to tackle.
Yeah, and look, I think it is it's an area we do a lot around the change management here. We do need to recognise that these processes have improved drastically over the last few years, but that there are still, powerful silos, personalities in organisations who have clear preferences, and I think I'm a mathematician by trade, and so coming back to numbers is an enormously helpful way of doing that. But then you need to manage the change, because there will be effectively winners and losers who gain from a process. And so one of the things we do is we look at the change management associated with this, the people involved, and also the governance that you put around this. The last thing you would want is to get to the end of the process and for people to challenge the very makeup of the value framework, etc. So we make sure that we bring those parties together in a clear governance framework, and then manage the change as you would any other technology or way of working change throughout an organisation. So it's a really important area, and appreciate the question, because frankly these things won't work unless you bring all of those parties together.
Thanks, Matt. That was really useful. I think there's also a lot of questions coming in around the exact data that's required, the software that's required, the expertise on the side of yourself, Stefan, and Nat, that's required to start creating these sort of frameworks. And our utility audience very keen to look at the cost and return implications there as well. Maybe you guys can touch on that a little, but I'd also like to suggest that if you download the slide deck, NGRT members, there is a couple of reports at the end of the slide deck, one looking more in depth into the enterprise portfolio management that Stefan and Nat have been presenting on today, and one looking at the full Gartner report that Copperleaf currently have on this on their website. So please do download the slide deck, and you'll be able to get all the further information on that. In terms of how people get started, we're starting to look at this from a sort of enterprise perspective. Stefan, what's the best kickoff point? Obviously, I know you'll be happy to follow up with the specific questions that are coming in, but is it a case of speaking to you and coming up with a roadmap? How do utilities, I suppose, start on this journey?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in fact, there's one question here that was asking if it exists. Are we so I think the answer to that is a number of clients here in the UK and globally, and they've been using this optimization capability to develop their most recent plans. Client of mine just putting the finishing touches to their latest price review as we speak. And so very much this capability exists, and I think the best way to really appreciate it is to get a flavour of that yourself. And so Nat and I are very happy to follow up with interested parties to discuss the relevance to your organisations and give you a flavour of what that capability can look like.
Yeah, and I think it plays a little bit into the point you're making, Dan, about how to get started. One of the things I know, having collaborated with Stefan and other clients, is the ability to have that pre-existing solution. So the projects don't start from a blank sheet of paper. In particular, they're pleased that the value framework exists. I know in the UK, for example, your product is already compliant and built to the NOMS mechanisms, etc. And so you kind of start with a framework in mind. Similarly, often clients look to build this capability where they're looking to improve their investment management processes, portfolio management processes. And so we've got a set of leading practice processes that we can use, and it gives a great starting point. So you don't start from nothing. You can move in and say, okay, how do we want to change and tailor to our own needs? And I think that's a really important way of getting started without spending 6 months of thinking.
No, exactly right, and a very good point. We've got one final question, just because it's come in a few times, that I feel like we should cover before we sign off. We're at risk of running slightly over, but the level of engagement is such that I'm sure our members don't mind. So final one to sort of get stuck into is, and I think a challenge worth talking about a little bit is, technology solutions are evolving faster than ever before, and there's this massive shift from utilities as a provider to more of a service, and more going onto the edge of the grid in terms of intelligence and IoT and data points than ever before. There's a lot of questions around how to minimize the risk of redundancy when you start planning for optimization, and the impact on life cycle that this ever-evolving digital landscape now poses. Is that a challenge that you guys are seeing a lot in these projects in terms of when trying to assess ROI on new projects, looking at redundancy, life cycle, reliability issues? Maybe you could speak a little bit to the challenge of this fast-evolving tech landscape.
Yeah, look, I think there's no doubting that technology is evolving, and we've seen that on both sides of the equation. If we're talking about build solutions, then we now need to consider new technology on that side. And equally, I think Stefan pointed to the emphasis that we're now being forced to embrace, certainly in electricity, about no-build solutions, whether it's a demand-side response concept or otherwise. And so you do need structure, and you need a way of bringing that together in a quantitative fashion. The one piece that doesn't go away, I guess, on the asset side is the need for a really good understanding of the asset data, the failure curves, etc. And that input has always been important and continues to be. And with new technology, we need to work closely with manufacturers to understand that. In terms of no-build solutions, then yeah, look, we're making assumptions about the impact of no-build solutions, but that's what the regulator is asking us to do. We need to have a clear view of the costs and benefits of a no-build solution, or indeed the impact of new smart grid solutions. So yeah, look, technology is changing, but I would also offer finally that technology is an enabler. If I go back to the beginning of my career and all of the work we used to do in Excel spreadsheets and such like, then the world has changed, and we can embrace new technology to enable us to apply the constraints, optimize, etc., across many, many more possibilities than we ever could before. So an interesting topic, but part of the problem and also part of the solution.
Thanks ever so much. I think that's probably going to have to be it for this afternoon, because we are now 1 minute over our allotted time. But I think the fact that we're struggling to pack in all the questions just shows how engaged and how much work went into that presentation, both Nat and Stefan. So thanks ever so much for joining us this afternoon. Anyone who's had questions that haven't been answered, we will pass them on to Stefan and Nat, who will do their best to get back to you and to obviously follow up with further details on the solution and how they may be able to help. Stefan, Nat, thanks ever so much, and thank you to all the Engerati members for tuning in this afternoon. Goodbye.